as you know, the paper's planned to go alongside Anne's presentation. She explained to us some of the most interesting things she has found in the Ottoman textiles. And some of these are from the Damascus room, and some of the ones I'll talk about today are from the Syrian room. And they are all Ottoman. They should all be familiar to you. The details I'll show you are Anne's. She generously shared them with me. The object photos come from David Franson, the photographer here. I have supplemented these with some of my own images taken at the London Victoria Albert and some other comparanda from published sources. I'd also like to say something about the structure of the talk. I'm going to start with a wide view. I would like to give you an idea, sort of the who, where, when of this type of textile, and I'll show some comparanda too. I'm then going to zoom in and pick up some of the things Anne had talked about, some of the more interesting, or what I think are interesting details. I'm also going to talk about how these details were reflected in contemporary Ottoman sources. And these are mostly court cases, which came up in Jim's talk, and also the occasional imperial edict. Equally important, I'll talk about how some of the great stuff that we found in the textiles are not reflected at all in the documents, and what this can tell us about history and historiography. So here are the textiles we're talking about. I'll go back. These are all from the Doris Duke Foundation, and from now on I'll be putting the Doris Duke ones on the left, and there'll be some comparanda on the right. So the objects here are part of a much, much bigger group. I would guess that there are over 600 still extant, and that begins to give you a sense of the scale of manufacture. We also have merchant records dated from the 16th and 17th century, suggesting that people traded in the dozens and the hundreds of these, which again should give you a sense that they are commodities. They were woven in Bursa and two nearby towns, Bilecik and Goynuk. We know this from records that were made in the cities themselves in the 16th and 17th century. We think the date of production for the type is probably starting in the 1580s, going to about the 1740s, but with variation, of course, during those years. As for Bursa, we know from Evliya Çelebi, who was a very famous Ottoman traveler and writer. He went to Bursa, 1641. What did he have to say? He said a good part of the population of the city and the surrounding areas were involved in the production of silk, and especially in the making of a fabric destined for use as sofa cushions. He wrote the cushions were ruby-colored. He described them in very precise terms as chatma munakash kadife, and this means voided velvet with gold brocade. So we have a fairly tidy correlation then between object and term. And I'm going to talk about chatma. It's much easier to start with. Voided and brocaded velvet is really kind of cumbersome, so we'll go back to the Ottomans, and chatma it's going to be. Now, most of the cushion covers, like this one, use centrally planned designs, usually a medallion of some sort. But the other formats of the textile tend to use overall patterns. And these are, this one is from the Doris Duke. I think it was probably a quilt face. This is 1/4 of what would have been the whole. It would have been basted onto a quilt as a very elegant item. And as we know from Anka's presentation, the quilts were sometimes folded up, set in rooms. It's another manner of display. There's also another format that was probably used as a sitting cloth. All of these motifs are typical of the 17th, 18th centuries, the Ottoman repertoire. There's nothing too surprising about them. The proportions of the single pieces are relatively consistent. Loom width is about 65 centimeters, and they're usually about 100 or 110 centimeters long. Now, the structure, there's some more examples. There's the Doris Duke one and several more pieces. We're pretty sure, too, that they were happy to use the same setup over and over again to make slightly different ones, or even different formats, again, using the same loom setup. Now, I'll pick up a little bit of what Anne was saying. The structure on these is very consistent. They all use a 5-shaft satin foundation with an extra set of warps, the ones in crimson. During weaving, the weaver takes these, he loops them around a little stick, and then he cuts them to make the pile. All of them use an extra brocading weft which was, at some point, silk wrapped in metal. And this is what created the areas of silver and gold decoration. And I should emphasize right here, all of these actions are performed en the loom. There's no embroidery or applique afterward. To say something quickly about how it worked. These were made on draw looms equipped with pattern harnesses. It required 2 experts to operate these. Before they were woven, though, the designing of the motifs required an expert to figure out how he could get the loom to do this. It required another expert to set up the loom. Once it was set up, as Anne said, the weavers could use the same setup over and over again to their heart's content. If they ran out of thread along the warp, which was the one that had to be set up, they could simply tie new warps on. And as you can guess, all the materials that are visible here had to be made ahead of time. They certainly weren't made by the weavers. We have men who imported the silk from Iran. We have the people who spun the cotton parts, the metal thread makers, the cotton thread makers, and the dyers. So it's quite a complex set of industries all involved at once. I'd like to give you a little more background on the type. Our evidence dating from the late 16th century shows that, as in this painting, chatma from Bursa was used in the Ottoman palace for cushions. You can see this one. You have lappets along the edge. It's almost certainly the same thing. Paintings and other documents moving along the century show their use through the 18th century, as we see here in what's probably meant to represent an urban house, probably Istanbul, probably upper class, but certainly no longer palatial. And this is something we might come back to. Now, the sort of pinning down the demise of the style is a little bit more difficult. We have a change in fashion and taste, perhaps, starting somewhere maybe between 1750, 1770, and there's still sort of a compulsion to put lappets on the ends. It's an end finish, those funny little niche are gone, but it's still about the same proportion. This sort of begins to fade a little bit more, you'll recognize this, and I would guess by about the 1890s, it's totally gone. And this one was made not in Bursa, but in a special factory that was set up to supply the Topkapi Palace. And this was actually, we think, commissioned by Sultan Abdul Hamid. So I think I've given you the crash course. If you have any more questions about the history or the type, please ask me later. And I think now I'm probably obligated to say why I'm talking about these. They are pretty clearly a Western Anatolian product. And we have them in the installation, but otherwise doesn't seem like they have much to do with the Ajami interiors. At least to say we're considered an 18th century Damascus. Here, yes, but again, 18th century Damascus, I'm not so sure. Except that we're pretty sure that the type, and especially the cushion cover type, like the one we're seeing here, was used in houses in Greater Syria during the 17th, 18th, and probably the 19th century. In 1781, some poor unfortunate merchant was ambushed outside of Aleppo. He lost his life, but he also lost a full saddlebag full of Bursa-style velvet cushions. They were being traded in quantity. Also, judging from provenance records, quite a few of the type came to museums in Western Europe, which have big collections. From Greater Syria, these are big dealer families with contacts in all parts of the Levant and in North Africa as well. Best yet, I think, Anka has shown us the primary role textiles play in furnishing interiors. Surely Ottoman subjects, especially people who were able to afford this kind of textile, were mobile and also very able to acquire things from all over the empire and probably from all over the world. So now I've given you the introduction and a little bit of context, and I've also managed to justify myself. So I think I should also get into the meat of the talk and try to explain what I mean by regulation. And the philosophy that we think guided the regulation of craft and trade in the Ottoman Empire comes from some different strands. I mean, it's predictable, right? It's Islamic and it's Judeo-Christian as well. It's too much to take on right now. I think for today, it's probably enough to note that the Sultan's legitimacy rested on ensuring what I call marketplace justice for his subjects. He had to make sure they could afford bread and meat, also clothing and shoes. He had to make sure that they weren't cheated by people selling shoddy stuff. For goods traded from a distance, for luxury goods as well, the authorities also tried to ensure that merchants, especially, did not engage in price fixing, hoarding, or gouging. Related, and perhaps most salient for us, is the idea that the quality of goods that the craftspeople made, whether it's textiles or brooms or rifles or handkerchiefs, had to correspond with the price that was asked. But specific standards that governed each object or each craft, none of these come by fiat from some central imperial authority. They don't even come from a local authority. Rather, we're pretty sure, almost entirely sure, that groups of artisans agreed among themselves whatever standard it was, and then produced goods that adhered to it. At least in theory, that's what happened. These standards, for the same reason, are largely unrecorded. In the same way, the violations, sort of transgressions I'm going to talk about, these are breaches in standards. And probably, again, this is discussed mostly within the group of artisans. There's not going to be a record of this necessarily, at least not in writing. I would also guess that sometimes whole groups of weavers or whatever artisans decided on their own to make some changes or economizations and then hoped that nobody would notice as well. But sometimes an individual or a group would come to the Ottoman Sharia court, they would make a specific accusation about bad practice. And this is where we get the written evidence. Now for the weavers, the statements they made in front of the Sharia court can use very specific words to describe the workmanship and materials. For instance, they distinguish high-quality Persian silk, which they call harir, from lesser quality silk, tilan and kenar. Both of those are still from Persia, but they're less good. They also talk about broken silk, guguz, where no longer do we have that incredibly long filament, but little pieces of waste are strung together to make a thread. It's not even a filament anymore. So, in general, though, the cases represent a fairly complicated tangle of economic and social interests, right? We have the merchants, the thread makers, the weavers, the guys who collected taxes. We have the market inspector and the grand vizier, who are both representing the sultan. And we have the consumers. And all of these people are defending their interests in one way or another. Now let me take you through a couple of these court cases which are relevant to some of the things we noticed in the Damascus room textiles and also the Syrian room textiles. In a case from 1599, we have a man named Bali ibn Ali and a Bustan ibn Mehmet. They were brought in front of a judge by Nasruddin ibn Mehmet. All three of these guys wove chatma. Nasruddin reported that the other men were using wefts made of broken silk and cotton. They should have been using the higher quality silk. He asked the judge to stop these men, to prevent them from continuing. And actually, this is unusual. Bali and Bustan, they replied. They say, in past times, this use of cotton and broken silk is not forbidden, but now it is. And the subtext here is that why should cotton and silk, the broken silk, be forbidden now when in the past it was okay? This isn't right. And for Ottomans, this is really typical language and sentiment. The older the practice or standard, the better it was. We always are looking back to a golden age of better practice. So the judge, what does he do? He calls in the experts. We have Osman Chalabi and Al-Hajj Hassan ibn Mehmet from the silk sellers market. We also have a master weaver named Hindustani Ahmed Chalabi. And they deliver an opinion. They say, for chatma that is woven and sold in lengths, cotton and broken silk wefts are forbidden. However, for velvet woven for cushions, cotton and broken silk weft threads are permitted. And this is recorded by the court. Now, from the material perspective, the ruling seems like it's kind of borne out, like maybe in part. We've seen the cotton weft threads, and they are constant. The chatma cushion covers conform to the ruling of our three experts. They allow this use of cotton. There it is. But we also have the chatma makad, the one both of these are considered upholstery by the length. They have cotton weft threads. They use the same filament on the back. This is despite the fact that the three experts had absolutely forbidden it. Now, in 1602, so this is just 3 years later, we have an Ali Bey ibn Uwais. He's a tax farmer. He collects dues on the silk scales in the market. He reported that another chatma weaver, Hassan ibn Abdullah, he was using cotton wefts. And the court scribe sent a letter to Hassan's workshop. He said that an inspection would be made of his looms. And if cotton rather than silk was found, this would be registered as a great fraud. Now, we have to note right here that bringing a suit cost 20 silver pieces, and also the accuser had to pay for the inspection of the looms. So clearly, somebody was really worried about their livelihood. This is not just a nuisance case. So what's going on here? So we have 1599, we have a rule that had been written or rewritten. In 1602, just 3 years later, people are attempting to rewrite again, perhaps. And when we analyze 17th century chatma, like the ones we see here, the surprise is really not how inconsistent they are in some of the finer details. Like, this is quite normal for pre-industrial production. The surprise is how consistent they are in violating everything that was set down in the documents. And sometimes things are surprising even to us. This is something from London where we don't even have the thread anymore, the elegant gold brocading, it's wire. This is not specified in the court documents.